Okay guys, so right now we're going to be talking about CPUs. So CPU, the brain of the machine. Before we dive into that, let's talk. I'm just going to give out some terms we will mention during this video. So we'll talk about hyperthreading, CPUs in general, CPU frequency, overclocking, APUs, cores, and that's about it. So let's start. The CPU is the brain, the heart of the machine. It's kind of the center of everything. It's where you start up building from. So the CPU basically does the heavy lifting of the computer. It runs the programs. It does the job. And the CPU is one physical block. And inside that physical big block, there are other smaller blocks. Each one of these smaller blocks is called a core. And they work individually to perform a task simultaneously. Therefore, the more you have of them, the better it is, the faster your machine will run. However, cores is not the only thing that matters. When buying a CPU, you also have to consider something else, the frequency of the CPU. Now, what is frequency? The frequency is the action the CPU can undertake in a second. The higher it is, the faster it runs. And typically, CPU frequencies are measured in gigahertz. The higher that number, the better. For example, my processor runs at 3.3 gigahertz, and it goes to turbo to 3.9 gigahertz. We'll come back to turbo in 2 seconds. So, when you have a CPU, you can do something really cool with it that people who are nerds, geeks, and all that, those guys can do, and it's really cool. It's called overclocking. So what you're doing is you're taking the CPU, which has a clock frequency, which has a guaranteed frequency. Basically, it's the frequency that the manufacturer of the processor, guarantees that the processor will run at. So, for example, if it's guaranteed to run at 3.3 gigahertz, you know that it's going to run at 3.3 gigahertz. And if the CPU does not run at that speed, then the manufacturers, basically what they do is they replace it for you and give you another one, which will run at that speed. Now, overclocking, what it does, it basically takes CPUs which have unlocked software, which you can meddle around with them, like play around with their software, and you can make them go much faster. You can overclock them, take them over the clock that is guaranteed. Now, with those CPUs, what you do is basically make them go faster. It's kind of like pumping steroids into the CPU. Now, there's dangers behind doing that, just like there's dangers behind doing steroids. When you're overclocking, you have to be really, really careful because the thing can overheat and just burn. And you do not want like $600 to just go whoosh, burned and not given back to you. But you can get overclocking guarantees on some processors, so they will replace the processor for you even if you burn it out when overclocking. Now the good things about overclocking is that a CPU will run much faster, therefore you'll be able to undertake actions like video editing, rendering, much faster without, and it will just take less time. Now let's move to the two major brands. There's Intel and there's AMD. So there's a few differences between each of these brands. Intel has this insane technology called hyperthreading, and what hyperthreading does is basically takes a physical core of your CPU and basically adds on a virtual one to it. It tricks the computer into believing there's twice more cores than there actually are, therefore making your CPU work twice faster than it actually does. This is just insane. And AMD does not have this technology, so that's one thing that gives Intel the edge over AMD. Another nice thing about Intel is they have something called turbo frequency. Turbo is kind of giving your machine that extra kick, giving it nitro. It's guaranteed to perform at that nitro speed. So my machine runs at 3.3 gigahertz without turbo, and then when I play video games, it turbos up, and the speed goes up to 3.9 gigahertz. So that's really good. Now AMD, some problem they have is that they usually overestimate the speed of their cores. So if it says 4 gigahertz, it doesn't usually run at 4 gigahertz. The processor. However, a nice thing they have is they got APUs, Accelerated Processing Unit. First of all, you have to understand that all processors have graphics chips in them, so you do not have to have a graphics card to make an image like this, but it's usually useful if you're playing games. However, AMD, they've integrated a really good graphics card by CPU standards, therefore it'll be rather good, and you can run. So basically, it allows you to run a lower end graphics card with that APU and still get kick-ass performance. So moving on to the second part of CPUs, talking about the compatibility. Now the CPU has small pins at the bottom, and those pins basically connect into the socket of the motherboard. And the sockets, they come in different styles. For example, Intel, it has an 1155 socket, the one I'm currently using, and these are basically the mid-range processors, the normal processors. They use this socket for Intel. Then there's the Extreme processors, which use the 2011 socket. Extreme just says it all. They're just like crazy stuff. Just the sort of stuff 99% of you guys won't need. Then there's AMD. AMD has two major sockets, the AM3 Plus and the FM1. Additionally to this, if you get a processor which is unlocked, you want to also get a motherboard which is capable of overclocking the CPU, because what's the point of